Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Markus Luhr, and I'm excited to have a fellow German speaker with me on the line here today, although we will be doing the interview in English. Calling in from Switzerland, Mr. Dominik Schmid. Welcome to the podcast, Dominik.
Hi, Markus. Thanks very much to have me.
No, it's great. And I'm looking really forward to digging into the topic here today. So just to frame this a little bit, Dominik has had a very illustrious career coming in as a lawyer into the world of sports and worked for many years with ISL, Prisma, Kirch Sports Group, and later on in Infront. During an era where in the 90s and the early 2000s, where a lot of interesting things happened in FIFA and many books been written about it. So Dominik knows a bit of that dirt in the right word of the true sense of the word, and we'll dig a bit into this. And then they spend the last 14 years really as an entrepreneur, working in different areas, different businesses, being founders and partners in it. And so I think we're going to have a nice, interesting discussion about a little bit about the I don't know whether we should call it the good old days of football, but and maybe the wrong word to use. But I want to just start off with, and before we get into the usual, how you got into the industry, that one of the books which had a dramatic impact on my view of sports was Andrew Jennings' book called Foul. And you mentioned earlier that he has a couple of new ones out as well. And anyone who read this, will know what I'm talking about. We'll get a bit more into this later. So let's get started a bit with, how you got into the industry, and what brought you into the world of football later on.
Yeah, sure. I studied law originally and qualified as a lawyer, passed the bar exam, never intended to practice as a lawyer. Mm-hmm. I later on got my MBA and ended up, that was in the very early 90s. We were going through a recession. Companies were hiring on campus and everybody wanted to get into investment banking, and hardly anyone got an offer, but I did. Mm-hmm. I wasn't really sure whether this is my world. I felt kind of peer pressure to accept the offer. I did it, went to work for JP Morgan. Turned out to be a complete nightmare for me because I'm simply not Mr. Corporate. Right. And I was in New York first, and then they transferred me to London. And I was sitting there in my apartment thinking, what the hell am I going to do next? Because that can't go on. Right. And so I was thinking what my options were, and I was less thinking about the desired position, rather a desired industry, which would really fascinate me. And actually, I came to the conclusion that there were two. One was car industry, which I wrote off immediately because I don't have an engineering background. So I would have ended up in the international tax department. And the other one was entertainment industry in its broadest sense. That could have been anything from music to films to including sports, because mm-hmm. Sports at that time for me was already part of the entertainment industry, although many people didn't see it like that. Right. So I saw a job published in a Swiss paper, which I had, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which I had subscribed to from London, that ISL was looking for a legal counsel. Mm-hmm. When I thought, well, do you really want to go to work as a lawyer? Actually, do you think you're capable of doing that? Because I never practiced law. And secondly, assumed that because this was published, that so many people would apply for that job that I wouldn't have a chance anyway. So I applied, and surprisingly enough, was contacted and ended up getting the job. Right. That's how I got into it. So I moved back to Switzerland. I started working at ISL, and at the beginning I really loved it. It was great. It was ISL at that time was really the the Goliath in sports marketing, because they had every major event. That was the World Cup of FIFA, of course, including every other FIFA tournament. It included the European Championships and the European Cup events from UEFA. It included the African Cup of Nations from CAF. It included the Olympic Games. It included basketball, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's interesting because I mean, my start was with ISL as well, although in a much smaller role for a very short period of time. But anyone who's is a kid of the '90s in our industry would know ISL. But if you are coming in much later in the industry, you might have never heard of it. But ISL was truly the giant in that space. IMG was very different. You know, they were always more focused on athletes. But when it came to owning the biggest global IP rights or being the representative of those, it was ISL, and there was no one came anywhere close to it. And so, and with it, as we both know, and you even more than I, obviously came a lot of big deals, but also plenty of controversial things around the world. Talk us through a little bit your period of time and what you saw was happening. Let's focus on the ISL part first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the beginning, I was quite naive. I wouldn't have thought in my wildest dreams that these things, which were obviously going on, would go on in any industry. I worked as I said, I started as a legal counsel. I negotiated major sponsorship contracts, mainly on the Olympic side, on the top program with Chris Renner and Roger Marmont at the time. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, with Stephen Dixon and Ross Berlin on the football side.
Yep. Ross was my boss in the US.
Yeah. I worked very closely with Ross. He's a really good friend.
Yeah.
Great. And we enjoyed ourselves really. We worked very closely on the World Cup in the US '94. Yep. But at that time, may I remind you, we're talking exclusively marketing rights, not media rights.
Yep.
So we were selling sponsorship. We put together the entire licensing program, which I think was probably at the time the largest merchandising program around a major global sports event that has ever been put together. And when Ross, after World Cup, left, he decided to join the Ryder Cup.
That's right.
Stephen Dixon took me to replace Ross, and so I moved to the operative business from the legal side and became the VP football of ISL. And had there basically my biggest project there was I was in charge of Euro '96 in England, which was probably the best tournament I ever experienced in the sense of getting on with the organizing committee.
It was a great tournament. Germany won it, so it can't be a bad tournament.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Then and also the African Cup of Nations in '96 fell into my responsibility. We had a little bit of a hiccup with Papa Diak at the time, who represented us in South Africa.
He's another good friend, actually.
Yeah,
I know Papa very well.
Did some funny stories. He made private deals on the side, and Stephen Dixon almost had a heart attack during the opening ceremony when these huge Coca-Cola banners appeared, because all these stadiums were supposed to be entirely advertising free, especially an opening ceremony.
Yeah. Well, coming back to what I was saying earlier with the book, Foul, the story really, which reading it blew my mind and maybe shattered a little bit my sort of, like you sort of said, innocent world of football is all about board kind of stuff. And because I've asked a colleague who had worked with at the FIFA World Cup in '94 and who'd been much closer to FIFA over all these years, I said, how much of it is really true? How much is just again journalism and making things up here? And he said probably about 90% of what's written in the book. And so It really destroyed my view, maybe my innocent view of FIFA and the world. Now you were right in there, right? And you maybe rightly said sometimes you probably had no idea what was going on. When did you get a sense that things weren't right? Was it really only later, or was it already during the time when you were right in the middle of it?
No, it was during the time, obviously. You see, it was there was clearly the one side within ISL which ran the business. That was us.
Yep.
And then there was the other side which was responsible or in charge of politics. That was predominantly the late Jean-Marie Weber.
Yes.
He always said, we kept using this phrase all over again because it was always, whenever you spoke to him about something related to FIFA, it was very political, very, very political.
I actually remember that. I know I knew Jean-Marie quite well, and that's exactly how he sounds.
Yeah, he was French for those who didn't understand that little change of accent.
Yes.
Anyway. And it was very clear that there were things going on. Jean-Marie he spent probably every day when he was in Switzerland. Very often he toured around the world. It was always funny to see his mountains of luggage which he carried around. You couldn't carry it. He always had a cart, from the railway station.
Right.
Which he brought up to the office. And but when he was in Switzerland, he spent every day at FIFA House. And it was kind of obvious for all of us that there were things going on which probably were a little bit on the edge, to say the least. It became very clear to me later on then, when especially in my later years at Prisma Sports Infront, but the feeling already started at ISL. Although we had a very close relationship to FIFA, and we were at that time rather autonomous because FIFA had no clue about marketing or anything, any commercial aspect.
Which many federations, I think, at that time, right? If you go back that long,
absolutely.
That was the norm, right? They didn't have marketing people; they had federation people, right? They knew how to run, well, sort of, the sports.
No, that's true. Absolutely. It didn't mean that was just FIFA, but it enabled us to develop programs. The famous FIFA football game from Electronic Sports. Mm-hmm. Sure you do.
Yes.
That was Ross Berlin's and my creation.
All right. Awesome.
We did the first licensing deal
with EA.
With EA in '93.
Amazing. So I have to admit, I can't quite recall, when did ISL blow up? In this was in the early 2000s, right? So by that time you had left already, I believe, right?
Yeah. I left at the end of '96. There was a big dispute between the operative management at ISL and the board of directors, which these guys didn't really know the business, but they thought they know it all. And people like Stephen Dixon, Peter Sproaches, or Tom Hipkins didn't agree with them on many strategic aspects. It was also the time when Peter Sproaches actually came up with the idea that we should bid for the TV rights rather than the marketing rights, or not only the marketing rights, and crafted this huge deal which ended up to be a 2.8 billion Swiss franc guarantee, as opposed to, for the World Cup 2002 and 2006 compared to 98, where FIFA generated, I think, $165 million from the television consortium.
Wow.
And in order to do that, Peter got into talks with Dieter Hahn, who was at the time the head of DSF, Deutsche Sportfernsehen, which today is Sport 1. And so Kirch got involved. The Kirch Group at the time was I think the largest media conglomerate in Europe, and one of the major players in the world, media industry. And so the plan was evolved over time, really on the background of these disputes, to really establish a new agency which would be backed by Kirch.
Right.
And
so
that happened.
Kirch Sports came in, is it? Or
no, Prisma. That was Prisma first.
Oh, Prisma first. Okay.
Yeah, so in early '97, we started Prisma Sports Media. We moved to Zug, away from Lucerne, and it was the three which I mentioned before, plus John Christic, Michael Frankham, and myself. So we were six people who started that agency. And immediately ISL tried everything to destroy us.
Right.
Up to the first 6 months at Prisma, I acted 100% as a lawyer. Because they sued every one of us. They sued the company. They sent us the police to our premises to search the premises. And I had to coordinate all these lawsuits with our lawyers, which were, of course, Swiss lawyers, because it took place in Switzerland. And I was the only German-speaking guy in the company. So I took care of all these lawsuits, which we either won or at the end of the day, FIFA actually really made pressure on both sides to come to a mutual agreement, because they said, it started to become public. I mean, it's for sure the only time I made it on the front page of the Financial Times.
Right. And what was the dispute about? Was it just because they were worried about you guys knew so much, you would take away sort of rights and contracts, or you were actually looking to take some of that away? I mean, what was their big fear?
No, I think their biggest worry was in conjunction with the TV deal, which had just been signed with FIFA.
Okay, and, but that wasn't ISL's rights anyway, right? So that was a new deal, right? In essence.
Yes, but it wasn't ISL's rights. You see, one of the board members made the essential mistake just prior to the signing, because originally the contracting party would have been ISL.
Right.
And Kirch would only have been a guarantor. And then one of the board members got cold feet and said, no way we can take such a volume on our balance sheet. And he wanted Kirch to become a joint contracting party. That's how we got really into this deal. And that's why ISL was so terrified.
Got it. That makes sense. Now, just to talk about some numbers here, because, at that time, as you earlier mentioned already, the numbers jumped dramatically, right? It was the first time, I think, people really were writing large checks for those type of events or competitions. Now, I don't know whether you have some rough numbers of, did the gamble pay out? And I know it did, from what at least the things I've heard. But, what sort of numbers did we end up seeing there? You guys were then generating on the back of it, especially for the TV side of it.
Oh, yeah, it worked out in a massive way. Although, the 2.8 billion, it was 1.3 for the 2002 World Cup in Korea, Japan, and 1.5 for the World Cup 2006 in Germany. Yep. These were the guaranteed amounts which we had to pay whatever happened. And that didn't include our costs, because we were not only responsible then for distributing the rights, but we were also in charge of producing the signal.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's it.
For that purpose, HBS was founded. First was a joint venture between ISL and ourselves with a steering committee of 6 people. These were interesting meetings at that time.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And the production alone for the Korea-Japan World Cup was something in the area of $180 to $200 million, right? Which came on top of the guarantee. All the other distribution costs, whatever we did, came on top of that guarantee. So we obviously had to sell the rights for good amounts in order for the deal to be profitable to us. Long story short, it was hugely profitable.
That's nice to see when gambles work out. Where was the big money coming from? Was it out of the traditional European markets, I'm sure, at that time, right? I don't think the rest of the world had really caught up yet, right?
Well, it depends a little bit. Yeah, it was mainly the big five in Europe. And that was also, after that dispute which we had with ISL, this contract actually got split into two parts. Kirch got Europe and ISL got rest of the world. And we were very happy about that.
Yeah, that's right. That's where our buddy Charlie Charters was selling it in here out of Hong Kong, I think.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And the big money came from the big five in Europe. That's Germany, UK, France, Italy, and Spain. Yeah. And for the rest of the world, it was Brazil mainly.
Right. And were you involved in the actual negotiations? Was your role part of that, or you were at a different remit at that time?
No, I was in charge of. Well, first my title was VP FIFA business, because I was really the liaison. I was the guy who was dealing with FIFA on a daily basis, coordinating everything. It was later changed to. No, it wasn't VP. It was executive director, and it was later changed to executive director of broadcast operations, which included we built up the broadcaster servicing department. We started as the first time broadcasters were treated as clients, right. Like sponsors, yeah. And we also, I was also running the production side of it. So I was the chairman after ISL's demise. I became the chairman of the steering committee. And I worked very closely with Francis Delier, who did a tremendous job, obviously. Yep. And we worked out all the strategic decisions. Like we, for example, decided for World Cup 2002 to make the production in HD TV, and that was the breakthrough for this technology. You always need a major sporting event. That history proves that in order to go one step further. Color television, for example, made its breakthrough with the Munich Olympic Games in '74.
Yeah. Now, here I have a question, because I'm been selling rights for my whole life here. Taking something like a World Cup. I mean, I always say, it's not difficult to sell a World Cup, and that's maybe true. What's difficult, of course, is getting these big numbers, right? And no broadcasters likes to, see these rights fees jump, dramatically from one year to the other. Especially now, you guys, put a lot of money on the table, so you had that extra pressure. Talk us through a little bit how you got groups to see that you have to pay 5 times, 6 times, 10 times more than you previously. What was the real argument there? It was still World Cup football. It was great sporting event. It's great content. That's the easy part. But why would you pay so much more than you paid last time?
Well, you could basically show them based on real numbers that the World Cup previously was totally undervalued. Okay. Because it's pretty easy to establish the value of the commercial airtime during a World Cup match, for example, or surrounding a World Cup match. Right. And that was one of the strongest arguments, I guess. The other one is it's very psychological, because also compared to the past, obviously the TV landscape changed drastically with private stations coming into play, with pay TV coming into play. And the old players from the broadcast unions, like all the public stations who used to be, they were the kings, they were the heroes. Nobody could ever threaten them with anything. And all of a sudden they saw, there might be competition, because it's no longer our own consortium, but it's a third-party agent who decides who gets the rights. So obviously it became a competition, a competitive bidding process.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. The European Union. Yeah.
And it's for every broadcaster, the World Cup was and still is a must-have property. because you hardly ever get better ratings than when you show the World Cup or the Olympic Games.
That's for sure. Yeah. But now, I know you're no longer that much involved in this space, and we'll talk about the things you're doing now. But you are very heavily involved in digitization. And obviously when you started, it was still very much an analog game. Where do you see where this is heading? Never forget the virus and how the whole world is currently on lockdown. But where do you see the future of the World Cup? The next few events are coming up. Do you see the continuation of that growth trend which started, or you see a plateau or plateauing it out here?
Well, that's always a wild guess. I mean, we thought at the time that it can't go any higher anymore, and it did substantially, of course.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure how, especially the World Cup, will evolve with now the changed format as of not the next World Cup, but 2026, when it will be played with 48 teams, because I think now they just overdid it. Greed just killed the event. Greed plus politics, as usual. Yeah, of
absolutely.
Course.
But has that actually been confirmed? I have to admit, I keep following it, but has that been officially?
Yeah, that's confirmed. That's confirmed.
It is
confirmed.
Okay.
And also, what I don't really agree with is FIFA. One argument FIFA gave was that they had a study prepared which proves that they would generate something like 500 or 600 million Swiss francs more in revenues.
Right.
Which I question that, because if I were a broadcaster, also a sponsor, especially a broadcaster, my argument would be, guys, I'm not going to pay you more, I'm going to pay you less, because now you want me to show matches in which absolutely nobody in my country has any interest. I can't sell the commercial airtime, or I can only sell it at lower rates. Plus, my logistical costs explode. Because now I have to move around a lot more people in the respective country, or countries in the case of 26, and we're talking about 3 countries. And
I'm not a big fan of it either. I never saw. I mean, I can see the logic why it helps him, wherever he will be in power at that time, to get votes, because you have more people you can please with having a slot in the World Cup. All that stuff from, again, pure political point of view. Yes, that makes all the sense in the world. Does it really create a better spectacle to let that many countries in, which we all know the quality of football therefore is dramatically different, and you really don't. You're not really talking about the best teams in the world anymore. I don't see the logic. There could be more revenue. That one I wouldn't completely disagree with, but yes, the cost will blow up, of course, as well. The other way around.
Yeah.
It's a crazy world. Now, before we move on into the second part here, talk us a bit about, then you ended up obviously with Infront, but there was obviously sort of this transition, right? Because I think something happened again with the rights, and that's how an Infront obviously was created. Talk more about that.
Yeah, no, actually, this was it's always the same, or almost the same company. It started out as Prisma. Later on, Kirch also owned CWL and ISPR in Munich, CWL in Switzerland. And Kirch decided to bring all these 3 agencies together in one. And
yeah, that's right.
First step was CWL, and that's when the name was changed. When CWL and Prisma were merged, the name changed to Prisma Sport, to Kirch Sports.
Got it.
And it was Kirch Sports until Kirch declared insolvency in March 2002, 3 months before the start of the World Cup. That was a really interesting period tale.
Yeah, I sort of vaguely remember that.
And then after the World Cup, obviously the the administrators of Kirch were looking for investors in Kirch Sport, because Kirch Sport was kind of the crown jewel of what was left of Kirch, not indebted and with a huge asset on its books, and so they were looking for investors, and ultimately the known investors, Robert Louis Dreyfus, together with one of his associates from Munich, and Jacobs, these were the two main investors, basically took over Kirch Sport with participation of the management, and the name was changed to Infront, but it was still exactly the same company.
Right, got it. Yeah, that all now comes back, and that makes sense. Now, just a quick one. Why went Kirch bust? Was it just he overstretched himself in other business areas? It didn't necessarily have anything to do with the football side of it, right?
No, absolutely not. The football side was very profitable for them. That's why they also wanted to hold on to these rights, and it took really the pressure of FIFA to have them transfer the rights from Kirch Media to Kirch Sports. I can't really tell you. Yeah, he just overstretched, especially his debt burden got bigger and bigger, and ultimately the real trigger was when what was he called, the chairman of Deutsche Bank at the time, Breuer or something like that. When he gave an interview on one of the American stations, Wall Street News in the morning, and said in public that Kirch is no longer creditworthy. That's when there is a huge lawsuit followed from that, which I'm not sure whether it's settled now or still ongoing.
I mean, there are still remnants, the sort of leftovers of all this mess created during the Blatter eras and everything else around it. As I said, what's your last kind of thoughts a bit on this era? Now, looking back, of course, and you mentioned earlier that you've done some work with Jennings and others. How do you now, looking back on all this? What would be your take on all this?
I am still absolutely amazed that this could go on for such a long time. I mean, it became more and more obvious what was going on, especially when FIFA started to get involved in the commercial rights and took more and more of these rights in-house. That made them completely exposed to whatever blackmailing operations there were out there. And don't forget that the executive committee was an entirely political organ of FIFA. It wasn't. The sports was, at the forefront, but in the background there were a lot of other interests going on, mainly monetary interest, of course. Yeah. And I argued for a long time that FIFA cannot be reformed. It's impossible, and we see now that it's impossible. I mean, they're going on as they did before, just a bit more. They're just less in the headlines, but I don't think much has changed.
Okay.
And
that's not good to hear.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, hate to say it, but I think you would have to. You can't really reform FIFA. I think you would have to start from scratch with a completely different organization. I mean, there is, on the one hand, don't forget that FIFA is an association under Swiss law, and the Swiss association law was basically made to accommodate rabbit breeders or something like that.
Okay.
But it wasn't thought
for big football.
Or for multi-billion organizations.
Yeah.
And I think you really would have to split the two sides. One, the pure sporting side, which includes by default political aspects, but completely separate that from the commercial side, and really set up an entity which is in charge of the commercial side and is run by professionals who know what they're doing.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, because that, obviously you could argue is should be the case for any federation, right? They really separate the administration side the same way you separate the commercial side. So the two things don't intertwine, and you don't use it to win votes and keep in power, right? I think, which is exactly what all happened here.
You see it when you compare the US to the rest of the world. American sports is run incredibly professionally.
Yeah.
Because for them it's a business, it's an industry, it's what they can make out of it without all the politics, and it works. They proved it works.
Absolutely. Now we could go on forever. This is such an amazing topic, and maybe we'll do another session on it just to dig more. But I do love to talk a bit about, because you spend a very considerable amount of the last 10, 15 years here in a different space. Really, the way I would call it, you kind of pivoted into being an entrepreneur more, and got involved in a host of startups and other businesses. And the podcast is called The Sports Entrepreneur. So let's talk a bit about that side of the business as well. Your learnings there, and maybe just give us a couple of quick ideas on where you get involved in and what worked and what didn't work here.
Yeah, sure. When I left, after I left Infront after the World Cup 2006 in Germany, I had one sport which I still would have liked to be involved in. That was Formula One, because I felt that was the only of the major properties which hadn't yet fully exploited its commercial potential. Mm-hmm. And I made I had made a project with Paddy McNally, who was the guy with the commercial rights at the time. And I made when I was with Prisma, we made a consulting project with him. Mm-hmm. And I approached him again at the end of 2006 because CVC had bought Formula One. Right. And I thought it would all be in their interest to really maximize their investment. Mm-hmm. So I started talks with Paddy again, eventually was invited by CVC to present my plans. I was quite honored because they invited three parties, IMG, WPP and myself.
Wow.
And I presented them my ideas for the program. They were all very excited about it, and I thought that was a slam dunk. It wasn't, because Bernie said no to it.
All right.
I was quite frustrated at the time.
And did you ever find out what Bernie didn't like about it?
I spoke to Paddy several times. Bernie was very slow in adopting a little bit of strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, the Formula One website was it was almost embarrassing until Liberty took over. And obviously now puts much more effort into the digital side. But Bernie was very reluctant to touch any of that. I mean, the drivers weren't allowed to do anything on social media and so on and so forth. Yeah. And my proposals were very digitally driven, of course.
Okay. Yeah, so, that's true. F1 had always a very, conservative approach. That's probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Very conservative. So I was at that time I was deep into the digital world already. I was fascinated with all the opportunities, with all the new things which came up, and all the new aspects you could see. So I clearly wanted to move on in the digital world.
So talk a bit about then. You had LibreVision and Zatu, and I think you were a bit involved in ESL as well there.
Yeah.
What was the roles and how did you what was it your part of it of the business?
Yeah, I started with Zatu for first. Zatu was the first streaming platform for linear television.
Right. In which part of the world?
It started in Switzerland, because Switzerland is very easy. Right. From a rights clearing point of view, you have to make one contract with one collecting society, and then you can put all the stations on your platform. Whereas in other countries, you have to negotiate with each broadcaster individually with all the different collecting societies. I did that in Germany because I was hired to build up the German market, which I did, and eventually we opened So2 in Germany with first the public broadcasters, later on the private channels who were strictly against it at the beginning joined in as well. But it was really a roller coaster to get it running in Germany with all the obstacles you have, and you really had to convince people that this is the future and they cannot go around it. They cannot go into denial.
But it didn't last that long, right? Or has it?
No, it didn't last for me. It didn't last for a lot of us. So2 today is very successful.
Oh, it's still around. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it's still around. It's very successful. It's a great alternative to all the other television offerings you get in these countries, because you pay a very small amount a month to get a lot more channels and in HD quality, and you can all stream it on your TV. So. It's a great offering, and they also do a lot of B2B stuff today. But at the time, So2 really needed another major financing round to further develop the company and implement all the plans we had, the strategic plans we had. And that, unfortunately, came at the time when the finance crisis hit the world economy.
Yeah, 2008.
Yeah, and nothing worked anymore. Nobody was prepared to invest money, substantial amounts of money, and So2 had to go over to a massive layoff, and most of us were gone because they couldn't pay us. It was a very small group that stayed, mainly engineers, obviously, to further develop the program. And then they recovered. They recovered.
Yeah, so they hunkered down and came back, which, again, talking about the environment we're in right now, where most of us probably see that there will be a global crisis of potentially the same magnitude, if not bigger, on the creation of this virus here. I think it's an interesting learning, right? So that people can come out of it. It might be painful, but there are ways. I think if you have a good product and if you can really shrink it down, right? I think there'll be maybe a good example, even, right?
Yes, and it also requires that you admit that you made something wrong at the beginning. The So2 started as that was actually the real selling point that initially, because it was developed by an information technology professor out of Ann Arbor, Michigan, University of Michigan. Mm-hmm. And his point was to prove that peer-to-peer technology works.
Right.
And it did work, but it only worked to a certain extent. We overstated the peering factor because it was a maximum of 20%.
Right. Okay.
And later on, they got rid of that, and they just admitted, "Look, we're a streaming platform now. That's it."
Yeah. Now, like I said, since then you obviously been involved in a host of different entities and different projects, and we unfortunately won't have time to go through all of it. But just pick another one here, which you talk a bit about and the learning which comes out of that.
The other one, which really is closest to my heart, that was Ogmara. That was an augmented reality company, mm-hmm. Which had a proprietary CMS, which was developed, and it was still based on image recognition, but we had huge plans to further develop the company. And let's face it, for me, AR is one of the biggest technological developments we see right now, yes. And it will be huge. It will be huge in the future. We've seen it for a long time. A lot of people don't realize that they've been confronted with AR for many, many years. Take Hawkeye in tennis, for example, yes. or all the technology they use in football games to show whether something was offside or not.
Correct.
And but it was Steve Jobs who said, and I think he was absolutely right. No, sorry, Steve Jobs, no. His successor, Tim Cook, who said in early 2017 that AR is going to be as big as was the introduction of the smartphone. Mm. And I fully concur with him. And I really enjoyed it. Working on this project, we also managed to acquire clients, but we eventually did manage to acquire sufficient financing to make it sustainable, which I think is the problem for most startups.
You run out of money.
You run out of money. You run out of money, and if you really want to implement your ideas, and your ideas if you want to do a startup company, your ideas have to be big. Otherwise, don't bother.
Yeah.
But the bigger the idea, the more it costs normally.
Yes.
It's also a right of timing. It very much matters whether you're at the right time, at the right place, with the right people. Mm. Being successful with a startup, for me, has a lot to do with luck.
All right. Yeah, timing, luck, and clearly sufficient funding are key components. And I guess from some of the experience you're just talking about, that's sort of what happened here as well, right? Some of that maybe you guys didn't quite have at the right time, right?
No, we were premature.
Yeah. It's
not yet main. AR is still not, well, is far away from being mainstream.
Right. Yeah, it's a bit like our experience with sports fixing and OTT. OTT, in my mind as well, is the future of broadcasters.
Absolutely.
No doubt about it. But if you don't have the money like the Zone has, it maybe isn't such a good idea to get in there. It's what we learned.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point there. Now, you obviously have your own agency too, and from what I can see, you've been obviously doing things on your own there over those years. So, what is the sort of projects you're involved in right now? What is the sort of things you can share with our listeners?
Right now, I am involved in something which I can't really share.
Okay, that's a short one. That's the short answer. But then tell us something you've maybe did before which you can share.
Yeah, well, I use this company mainly for different consultancy projects. I mean, at the early days of social media, which I started to get into very, very early and very thoroughly. And the company had no clue at that time about social media. So in the early days, I did a lot of consultancy projects for companies to show them how they can implement the social media strategy.
And that's still in sports, or you are? That's it. No. It doesn't matter which industry. It's broader.
Exactly. Right, exactly. Right. That was definitely broader. I couldn't do this today anymore because now you have all these with kits, and it really has evolved into a science of its own.
Yeah.
But it was quite fun time. It was kind of a pioneering era where you could play around a lot more because you had a lot less restrictions from the likes of Facebook and so on than you have today.
Yeah. So what would be your biggest learning from switching from, I would say, even if it was an agency, of course, but you weren't necessarily the entrepreneur in the agency there, switching then over the last 10, 15 years into this world. What was it your regret? What would have done differently now in hindsight, or any of those learnings?
Well, I think the biggest learning was that you don't always get everything presented on a silver tray.
Right. What does that mean?
Well, we were very spoiled in the especially in these times, like the 90s, early 2000s, being in the sports industry, because the world was your oyster.
Right. Well, especially when you talk these big name rights, which you had or you were involved with, that's for sure.
Obviously, it downscaled a lot, and but it was also. I also encountered a greater variety of things, which I actually quite enjoyed. It was more experimenting, but the risk was that you don't succeed.
Right. Yeah, that's what happens when you're an entrepreneur.
Yeah, exactly.
That's for sure.
Yeah, quite frankly, after some years, I started to miss the sports world. At the time when I left it, I was really, because of all the things I knew and all the things I saw which were ongoing, your competence didn't matter at the time. It was really who you were and who you knew. and what you paid in many instances.
Right.
So I was really fed up when I left. But a few years later, I started to regret it, because it's still probably the industry closest to my heart,
Right.
especially with all the new technological opportunities which evolved with the entire digitization that made it a completely new ball game, in which I would have loved to be part.
Yeah, interesting. So if someone now is looking for advisors who have your sort of background from sports, technology, media, what is the sort of jobs or consulting you're interested in? So maybe a little shout out to people here. How would you describe yourself right now?
I would definitely say I could advise people in a digital strategy capacity. That's something I got involved with very early on. That's something I'm still on top. Like I follow all the latest trends, developments on a daily basis, because that's something which I'm really interested in. And I think we will see a lot more now, thanks to the crisis which we're going through, which isn't a nice thing, but it accelerates this transformation in a major way.
That's for sure. Yeah, and again, just last one. You still looking at sports at all, or you are currently not really in the world of sports and mostly in other areas?
I'm currently not really in the world of sports, but I very much look at it, because I follow also there in particular, because it's so close to my heart. I'm a real sports fan. I can watch almost everything. And I'm a real technology fan, despite the fact that I'm a lawyer.
We won't hold that against you. My last question here before we wrap it up. Looking at being in there, obviously been involved in the in your early part of your career very heavily in sports, and therefore you would know this world inside out. Having seen it evolve, now you're in technology and you're watching that space. Where do you see now, again, using the crisis now, where do you see the big opportunities for technology to come in? A couple of nuggets where you think this can be a game changer in the production or in the delivery or in the how we make sports look amazing again, even without fans inside.
Yeah, that's the point. That's exactly the point. And I think that the real big game changer for me now, it was before already, but now it's really on the landscape. That's esports. I mean, if you, I don't know whether you ever watched one of these virtual Formula One races, or DTM I watched on Sunday, or we had the Swiss 5-year cycling race in Switzerland. Yeah. With all the real protagonists taking part in it. Yeah. And it's fascinating. The quality you see nowadays. It's if you wouldn't know that it's virtual, you wouldn't recognize it immediately.
True. That's right. And the graphics are amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's going. And electronic sports, in any case, has a huge future. I mean, if you look at how ESL developed, for example, from when I worked with them to what they are today, it just exploded. Yeah. And I think that's one of the very, very big things we will see in the future. I assume we will see more technology, especially on the side of augmented reality in sports coverage, more than we already see. I just hope they won't overdo it, because it can become too much. But the possibilities which are there and which become bigger and bigger with the evolvement of the technology itself, will be very big. I think it's a matter. It boils down to what fantasies you really have, what you could do, because the technology is there.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. Your imagination, you can let go wild with it.
Yeah.
Dominik, I really enjoyed this. I always love digging into some of the old stories of the 90s and earlier. And clearly you brought a lot of interesting memories back for myself here as well. So thank you so much for your time here. Stay safe there in Switzerland. Hopefully we'll see you back in the world of sports in some fashion again in the future. And, all the best there.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Marcus, and all the best to you as well.
Thank you. Absolutely. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Marcus Luer podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Marcus Luer. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.